This is round 3 of the PACE 2019 National Scholastic Championship. Toss-up number 1. Silhouettes of one of these objects, as well as of a bird, a key, and a chalice, appear on the chest of a headless man in the painting The Liberator. A large one of these objects is next to a depiction of one of them on an easel in the painting The Two Mysteries. Yet another painting of one of these objects is at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, was described by Michael Foucault as an unraveled calligram, and was first exhibited under the title The Use of Speech 1. The question, could you stuff one of these objects, was asked by a surrealist artist in response to a message he wrote in French below one of them. For 10 points, the message in the painting The Treachery of Images by René Magritte claims it does not depict what object? And that would be a pipe, or pipes, the plural. Could have also accepted tobacco pipe, smoking pipe, image of a pipe, anything that had the word pipe. Toss-up number 2. The Czech startup Leo, L-E-O, hopes to benefit from a new fourth package from the European Commission that will liberalize this industry, which China plans to expand from 4x4 to 8x8 by 2035. The largest infrastructure project in Kenya's history was a China-backed SGR project in this industry that boosted Kenya's GDP by 1.5%. A minister who oversaw this industry, Liu Zijun, was sentenced to death for a 2011 incident in Wenzhou, where 40 people died. Creating a Eurasian land bridge for this industry has run into challenges due to different gauge sizes between China and Russia. Japan's Shinkansen is an example of, for 10 points, what industry that provides bullet ground links between cities such as Tianjin and Beijing. And the word I needed there was rail. Anything about rail or trains, railroads, railways, high-speed rail, bullet trains, commuter rail, but would have had to prompt on transportation industry. Toss-up number 3. This unnamed conflict's origins are the subject of a book by the scholars Edgar Branch and Robert Hurst. A character in this conflict asks the narrator a riddle about where Moses was when a candle went out. One side in this conflict lives in a home in which the tacky poem Ode to Stephen Dowling Bots hangs from its walls. This conflict climaxes after the narrator retrieves a Bible with the message 2:30 written in it. The participants in this conflict listen to a church sermon about brotherly love while keeping their guns between their knees. In this conflict, a colonel and his sons are killed after young Sophia elopes with Harney. For 10 points, what deadly feud between two Kentuckian families is depicted in Huckleberry Finn? And the answer there is the feud between the Grangerfords and the Shepherdsons. It could have accepted a synonym for feud, but had to have the name of both families, the Grangerfords and the Shepherdsons. Toss-up number 4. A form of this technique that works on objects for which the well-founded relation holds its name is named for Emmy Noether. Augustin Louis Cauchy used both the standard forward form of this technique and its alternative backwards form to prove the AMGM inequality. This technique, which relies on the last of the Peano axioms to hold, is often used to show that n times quantity n plus 1 all divided by 2 is a formula for the positive natural numbers. In this technique, one assumes that some statement is true for some input n and shows that it is also true for n plus 1 after having proved a base case. For 10 points, name this proof technique which shares its name with a type of logic that goes from the specific to the general. And that would be a proof by induction, the necessary word being induction. Could have also accepted mathematical induction or an inductive proof, but would have had to prompt on proof. Toss-up number 5. This man lost his highest post after a sermon by Anton Pfister galvanized protesters who formed a 6,000-strong academic legion. This man published a pamphlet urging for defense against potential French attacks using the pseudonym A Friend of Universal Peace, and he once remarked that Italy was a geographic expression. In response to the murder of playwright August von Kotzebue, this man ordered the closure of student Burschenschaften in the Carlsbad Decrees. This foreign minister's negotiations with Talleyrand at a conference discussing the organization of post-Napoleonic Europe established the Concert of Europe. For 10 points, name this conservative statesman who represented Austria at the Congress of Vienna. And that statesman is Clemens von Metternich. I just needed Metternich, his last name. Toss-up number 6. In a backstory, a character with this profession entertained a general, even though the general was responsible for the death of his son Leonard in the Boer War. At the conclusion of a novel, a character in this profession hopes to pleasantly surprise his boss after he cries while viewing lights at a pier in Weymouth. A man with this profession is forced to fire 2 Jewish women in his employ after his boss starts hosting meetings attended by Herr Ribbentrop. An American named Mr. Faraday employs a man of this profession in a 1989 novel that consists of the protagonist's recollection of his former employer, a Nazi sympathizer named Lord Darlington. For 10 points, Mr. Stevens has what profession in Kazuo Ishiguro's novel The Remains of the Day? And the answer there is butler. Could have also accepted valet towards the beginning of the question before the word pleasantly. Would have had to prompt on anything about a servant or a manager. Toss-up number 7. Though this curve itself is not drawn in an Edgeworth box, its points are isoquants where the marginal rates of technical substitution of participants in an Edgeworth box are equal, since those points are also all on the contract curve. This curve's slope defines the marginal rate of transformation. This curve is typically concave to the origin, but the existence of economies of scale can cause it to instead bend inwards due to decreasing opportunity costs. Points inside this curve are not at full employment, while points outside it are unattainable for a firm or economy. A classic example of this curve uses guns and butter to illustrate trade-offs. For 10 points, name this frontier that shows configurations of different potential outputs. And the answer there is production's possibilities frontier. I just needed production possibilities. Could have also accepted production possibility frontier, production possibilities curve, PPF, or PPC. Toss-up number 8. This person gave a sermon about a man who was hit by a poisoned arrow, but cares more about the man who shot it than finding a surgeon. Another of this person's sermons occasioned a 10,000-fold world element to burst forth from the heavens and allowed a king to become the first stream enterer. He helped a follower understand formlessness simply by holding up a flower, a story exemplifying the perfection of wisdom genre of his teachings. This deliverer of the flower sermon gave his first sermon at the Deer Park in Sarnath, where he stated that eliminating craving, desire, and attachment would lead to moksha and the end of suffering. For 10 points, name this man who preached the 4 noble truths of his namesake religion. And that would be the Buddha. Could have also accepted Siddhartha Gautama or Shakyamuni. I could have also accepted. Toss-up number 9. In 1950, a computer scientist at the Rand Institute used this adjective to describe his research to hide its mathematical nature from politicians. This adjective describes an approach to algorithm design that solves overlapping subproblems. The CYK parsing algorithm is an example of it. Amortized analysis is used to study arrays described by this adjective. Those arrays have individual elements need to be copied over when they are resized, in contrast to fixed-length arrays. Memory that is put onto the heap is allocated in this fashion, often using the C functions malloc and free. This adjective describes a type of random access memory that is volatile and puts the D in DRAM. For 10 points, give this opposite of static. And that opposite of static is dynamic. Throughout the question, I could have accepted dynamic programming, dynamically allocated memory, dynamic random access memory. Toss-up number 10. This author of the anti-Catholic screed Conspiracy Against the Liberties of the United States was the know-nothing candidate for mayor of New York in 1836. This man was installed into the Order of Glory by Sultan Abdul-Majid I after demonstrating his best-known invention. Chemistry professor Leonard Gale helped this failed painter realize his best-known invention, the idea of which he discussed on a ship back to the United States with Charles Jackson. This man's magnetic company eventually merged with Western Union and was built on technology that first connected Baltimore and Washington, D.C. with the phrase, "What hath God wrought?" For 10 points, name this inventor of a coding system for telegraph messages. That would be Samuel Morse. Toss-up number 11. Chester Nathan Gould compiled a list of the names of these figures and their etymologies in a study of Old Icelandic religion. A passage in the Volupsa claims that these beings arose from Bremer's blood and Blaine's limbs. 2 of these figures dropped a millstone on a widow's head after drowning her husband Gilling. Those 2 owned Sun and Bodin, a pair of vats in which they mixed honey with the remains of the god Kvasir. Scholars sometimes identify the Svardalfar with these beings, 2 of whom, named Fjalar and Galar, made the mead of poetry. Another group of these figures, the sons of Ivaldi, created Sif's hair and Odin's spear, Gungnir. For 10 points, name these characters from Norse myth, a race of diminutive smiths. The answer there, dwarfs, or dwarves, or diverger, or divergar. And I could have prompted on svaltarfar before I said svaltarfar. Toss-up number 12. Microbubbles are mainly used in drug delivery to treat diseases of this organ. A controversial February 2019 Nature Microbiology paper suggested that dysfunction of this organ is linked to depletion of species of Coprococcus. An aggressive tumor in this organ presents with a butterfly appearance and can be slowed using alternating electric field therapy. New treatments for diseases of this organ may focus on drugging the gut bacteria that form an axis with it. Valproic acid and fluoxetine treat diseases of this organ, such as one known to be correlated with high monoamine oxidase activity. A barrier layer of astrocytes makes this organ notoriously difficult to drug. For 10 points, name this organ affected by glioblastomas and depression. And that would be the brain. Could have also accepted corpus callosum, cerebrum, cerebral cortex. Toss-up 13. Jack Weatherford credits this empire's success as a culture of meritocracy in his book on its founder's role in making the modern world. This empire created an official seal whose carriers could freely use postal routes and demand goods from civilians called paisa. Its law code declared all religions were to be respected, and Nestorian Christians were found at its court. This empire, which built the Yam road system, was the largest to select a ruler through a great council called a Kuriltai. After the Toluid Civil War was started by this empire's prince Arik Boka, it fractured into 4 realms, which included the realms of Chagatai, the Ilkhanate, and the Yuan dynasty. For 10 points, name this empire founded by Genghis Khan. And that empire is the Mongol Empire. Toss-up number 14. In a jam session with Biddy Fleet, this musician discovered he could use all 12 semitones of this chromatic scale to lead into any key, which influenced his greater use of often rapid passing tones. This musician authorized Aebersold and Sloan to transcribe his music for his namesake Omnibook, a series of 2/5 progressions characterize a variation on 12-bar blues that is sometimes named for this musician's Blues for Alice. A club on New York's 52nd Street was named his land. This musician contrafacted Ray Noble's Cherokee into his song Coco, which exemplifies a fast, upbeat jazz genre he pioneered alongside Dizzy Gillespie. For 10 points, name this bebop saxophonist of ornithology who was nicknamed for his love of chicken. And the answer there is Charlie Parker. I could have also accepted bird, or yard bird, or birdland. Toss-up number 15. A novel titled For This Stuff ends with the dying protagonist promising to meet his friend beneath the falls. In another novel titled For This Stuff, the Milky Way flows down inside the protagonist with a roar, shortly after flames consume a woman whom he'd earlier spied on a train caring for a tuberculosis-stricken man. This Stuff titles a novel centering on Satoko's affair with Kiyoaki, and which was followed up with Runaway Horses as the first entry in the Sea of Fertility tetralogy. A novel titled For the Stuff begins, "The train came out of the long tunnel," as an expert on Western ballet travels to a remote hot spring. For 10 points, Shimamura's affair with the geisha Komako is depicted in a Yasunari Kawabata novel titled For a Country of What Cold Stuff? And that would be snow. Could have accepted spring snow, snow country, or Yuki. Toss-up number 16. One of these instruments from India is tuned by applying Siahi paste and has a wooden variety called the Dayan, whose counterpart is the metal Bayan. Japanese players of another of these instruments, exemplified by the Kodo group, traditionally only wear a fundoshi loincloth during furious public performances. An Arabic instrument called the nakir evolved into the most common example of these instruments in Western orchestras, which is tuned using a sliding foot pedal and has a body that is usually made of copper. Asian examples of these instruments include the goblet-shaped darboka, the Japanese taiko, and the Indian tabla. For 10 points, name these percussion instruments, conventional kettle types of which include the timpani. And those would be drums. Toss-up number 17. A character in this play recalls seeing peasants stretched out side by side during a typhoid epidemic during the third week of Lent. This play's title character exclaims that a man, whom he once thought was a being of a higher order, was actually just a writer who writes about art, even though he understands nothing about art. It concludes with a speech thrice proclaiming, "We must rest," as the landowner Waffles plays the guitar. After a professor wishes to invest in interest-bearing bonds so that he and his wife Yelena can afford a dacha villa in Finland, the title character tries to shoot him but repeatedly misses. Professor Serebriakov is supported by Voynitsky, the title character of, for 10 points, what drama by Anton Chekhov? The answer there, Uncle Vanya. I could have also accepted Dядя Vanya. This, toss-up 18, this physicist introduced the concept of whispering gallery waves to explain echoes that could be heard from across the room at St. Paul's Cathedral. This physicist used a quasi-static approximation for the electric field near a radiating dipole much smaller than the wavelength of light to demonstrate that the intensity of light re-radiated by that dipole is proportional to the negative fourth power of wavelength. The resolution of an imaging system is limited by his namesake criterion, and his approximation to my scattering explains why sunlight traveling through lots of air at sunset appears red when it reaches our eyes. For 10 points, name this British physicist whose namesake form of scattering explains why the daytime sky is blue. And the answer there is Rayleigh, Lord Rayleigh. Could have also accepted John William Strutt or 3rd Baron Rayleigh. Toss-up number 19. Pierre Benton argued that Canada's last good year was during this decade. In the first year of this decade, First Nations people were given the right to vote in Canadian elections without sacrificing their treaty status. The red ensign was replaced with the maple leaf flag in this decade. Jean Lesage's election as premier in the first year of this decade began the Quiet Revolution in Quebec. Beaumark missiles were delivered to Canada during this decade, with the resulting controversy contributing to John Diefenbaker's electoral defeat to Lester Pearson. Pierre Trudeau was first elected as Prime Minister in this decade for 10 points. Name this decade in which Pearson gave a speech criticizing Lyndon Johnson's bombing of North Vietnam. The answer there, the 60s, the 1960s. Toss-up number 20. This philosopher quoted the jurist William Barclay, who argued against the monarchical Nicomax in a chapter discussing when the dissolution of government should be sought. A work by this philosopher refutes the claim that kings derived their authority from the biblical Adam and dismisses the glib nonsense found in the English of Robert Filmer's treatise Patriarcha. He used the example of humans picking apples from the trees to illustrate his belief that ownership comes from one's own labor. A book by this philosopher discussing the true origin and extent of civil government claims that all men are entitled to life, liberty, and property. For 10 points, name this philosopher who wrote 2 treatises of government. That would be John Locke. Toss-up number 21. The film The Song of the Mango was produced during a craze for mangoes during this period. Journalist Anthony Gray was imprisoned during this period after the British legation was stormed. This period was sparked by conflict with the 5-man group, which initiated studies on a play about a historical figure dismissed from office. It began with a newspaper editorial published on Children's Day titled "Sweep Away All Monsters and Demons." A popular slogan during this period was "To rebel is justified." During this period, which began in 1966, capitalist roaders were attacked in struggle sessions and targeted by Red Guards. For 10 points, name this period following the Great Leap Forward where Chairman Mao sought to purify communism. And the answer there is the Cultural Revolution. I could have also accepted that answer in Chinese, Wen Hua Da Ge Ming. And that concludes this packet. Hope you enjoyed.